A low mechanical wail runs through the city just before the first tower folds inward, and when Vought's telemetry flickers and dies, the control room displays lose every stable reading at once. On the avenue below, people run through falling glass while automated anti-threat batteries pivot without locking onto anything they can identify. And every camera eventually centers on a plain figure in a yellow shirt who stands in the open like he arrived too late to leave. Engineers shout over secure lines and containment protocols deploy automatically, yet the instruments that guide them return either impossible values or nothing at all. The man checks his nails as if the noise is someone else's problem, and the nearest drone stalls mid-scan before drifting sideways with no signal loss recorded. Across 3 monitoring stations, the same conclusion appears and is immediately rejected by software written to prevent exactly this kind of error. Vought's systems do not fail loudly. They stall, retry, and contradict themselves while the street continues collapsing around a target they cannot resolve. By the time escalation protocols engage, the data has already begun to diverge, and the response being prepared assumes a threat the building has not actually located. This is only where the readings stop making sense, and the decisions that follow will be made without anything left to measure. Stay with this and subscribe once, because what follows forces responses that spread beyond the street, and missing the next parts means missing the moment those responses make the situation impossible to contain. The first verified sighting did not come from a satellite or a patrol unit, but from a maintenance camera mounted above an employee entrance, where the feed caught a bald man in a yellow suit stepping out of an alley as if he had taken a wrong turn and decided to wait it out by the nearest corporate lobby. The door scanner registered nothing unusual, because it was never designed to question a person who didn't try to force entry, and for nearly 40 seconds he simply stood there, while the emergency sirens that had been cycling across Midtown continued to stutter through evacuation instructions. 3 blocks away, a containment alert had already escalated into a live response after a B-tier soup failed to subdue what dispatch labeled an unaffiliated hostile. But when the drone camera reacquired the man in yellow, he was not moving toward the threat so much as drifting in its direction with the absent pace of someone deciding whether a sale might still be open. Inside the lobby, security personnel were arguing over access control when the blast wave from the street bowed the glass inward, and the same camera caught him glance up with mild annoyance as the revolving door jammed against its frame. The unaffiliated hostile turned out to be a contracted test subject who had broken from a live Compound V demonstration, a towering figure who had already torn through 2 armored vans and left the asphalt pitted with impact marks that looked like artillery practice. When the figure pivoted toward the sidewalk, every camera in the block caught the same unremarkable civilian standing at the curb as if he were waiting for a bus, and the test subject lunged with a force that registered as a seismic blip across the municipal grid. The impact never came in the way anyone expected, because the bald man did not brace or dodge so much as lean half an inch to avoid stepping into a puddle, and the test subject's fist carved a trench into the street where he'd been. On the control floor, analysts began running threat classification as a formality, but the motion tracking failed to resolve acceleration, and the software that had never once misread a soup's approach vector returned an empty field where a speed value should have been. The man in yellow spoke once, not loudly enough for the external microphones to catch, and then he extended his arm with the same bored rhythm a commuter might use to press an elevator button that has already been lit for too long. The test subject left the ground as if a building had been dropped beneath him, rising through the air with no visible arc, until he vanished into the low cloud cover that had been rolling in from the river. And a moment later the cloud deck bloomed outward in a circular shock that set off window alarms across 5 districts. On the street, the man lowered his hand and looked around as if trying to confirm whether the noise had finally stopped, and when a delivery truck skidded into a hydrant, he stepped back to avoid the spray with the same reflexive care he'd shown toward the puddle. Dispatch attempted to reacquire the test subject's biometrics, but the tag had gone offline somewhere above the troposphere. Vought's internal network flagged the event as a probable sensor glitch and reran the capture with redundancy, which is how they noticed that the subject's body temperature read as perfectly normal. His heart rate was steady to the point of boredom, and the surrounding air pressure had not fluctuated in the way it always did when a high-tier soup exerted force. The classification suite tried to compensate by widening the acceptable ranges for output, but the predictive models diverged as soon as they attempted to extrapolate what had happened between the extended arm and the disappearance of several tons of engineered muscle. In the lobby, a junior guard opened the door to wave the man inside for safety, and he accepted with a nod that suggested he was more interested in the quiet than the protection. When the guard asked for a name, the man replied with Saitama and nothing else, and the badge printer stalled as if the request had exceeded its authority. Upstairs, Ashley Barrett's voice cut through a chorus of technicians as she demanded a live explanation for why a contracted asset had been removed from the city's airspace by an unidentified civilian who did not appear to be exerting himself. A camera was assigned to track Saitama as he wandered toward the reception desk and stared at a promotional display featuring the Seven, and when he tapped the standee of Homelander to keep it from tilting, the stabilization software logged the contact force as 0 before correcting itself to an error state. A containment team was dispatched with instructions calibrated for unknown tier anomalies, and their approach was coordinated with the assumption that the man might be employing some form of optical interference. Saitama watched them arrive with the faint patience of someone waiting for a line to move, and when they asked him to place his hands where they could see them, he complied because it was easier than explaining. The first net deployed with a clean trajectory and wrapped around his shoulders, and the team reported success for approximately 2 seconds before the mesh slackened as if gravity had lost interest. The tension sensors that should have registered resistance reported nothing at all, and when a second net layered over the first, the software interpreted the overlap as a configuration error rather than an increase in force. Saitama tilted his head, mildly inconvenienced by the way the cables tugged at his cape, and he lifted one hand to free the fabric so it wouldn't wrinkle. The motion caused a pressure spike in 3 separate instruments without any corresponding strain reading, and a handler shouted for a stasis field that failed to initialize when the power draw exceeded the hardware's rating. On the observation feed, Homelander leaned forward with a look that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite irritation, watching a man who did not resist so much as exist in a way the equipment could not translate. The moment the stasis projectors flickered out, the containment team stepped back to reevaluate their posture, and Saitama asked if there was somewhere quieter he could sit while they sorted it out. Ashley authorized a Level 2 detainment on the basis of noncompliance, and the transport cage was brought up from sub-level storage with the same reverence reserved for public disasters. As it rolled into the lobby, the floor-mounted sensors began to return contradictory readings that suggested both immense mass and none at all in the same space. By the time the cage door closed, the network had flagged 12 separate subsystems for recalibration, and the test subject's last known trajectory had been plotted into a re-entry window that would not intersect any ocean. Homelander stood from his seat as the predicted impact zone shifted toward a residential district, and the elevator doors sealed with a tone that signaled immediate deployment. Downstairs, Saitama sat on the transport bench and wondered aloud if this would take long, because he still needed to make it to the supermarket before closing, and the cage began to move toward a sublevel that had never once failed to hold what Vought put inside. The re-entry alarm triggered before Homelander reached the launch deck, and the predicted impact zone revised itself 3 times in under a minute, as the system struggled to reconcile a falling mass that was accelerating in ways it had not been programmed to anticipate. What had once been a contracted test subject now resembled a kinetic disaster, and the live feed from a traffic helicopter caught the moment he broke through the cloud layer like a dropped monument, trailing vapor and pieces of something that might have been the air itself. Emergency routing pushed civilians into underground stations, while Vought's rapid response unit attempted to pre-stage a perimeter, but every simulation they ran assumed a deceleration that never came. By the time the falling body crossed into the final kilometer, the impact corridor had widened into a city block, and the streets beneath it had already begun to empty under automated evacuation commands. Homelander exited the tower into a sky that was still rippling from the earlier shock, and he accelerated toward the projected strike point with the practiced confidence of someone who had caught worse things before breakfast. When the body hit, the street collapsed into itself with a noise that did not resolve cleanly into any single category of destruction, and the shockwave threw dust through open subway grates as if the city had exhaled. Homelander arrived at the crater seconds later, hovering above the churned asphalt while the test subject struggled to stand, bones resetting with audible cracks that the microphones boosted into a public broadcast before anyone could mute them. The soup's eyes tracked upward, and the brief, instinctive relief at seeing a known protector gave way to something closer to confusion when he realized the protector was not the one who had sent him there. Inside the sublevel transport, Saitama felt the cage lurch as the building absorbed the impact, and he glanced up from the floor where he'd been staring at a scuff mark on his boot. The escort team received a priority override that rerouted the cage toward a higher floor for rapid redeployment, because Ashley had decided that the only variable worth testing now was proximity to the earlier event. Saitama did not object when the doors opened onto a staging area, and when a handler asked him to step out, he did so with the same unhurried compliance that had complicated every previous attempt to define him. A technician attempted to attach a telemetry band to his wrist and watched it slide loose as if the clasp could not decide what it was closing around. At the crater, Homelander closed the distance and forced the test subject back down with a palm to the chest, containing the thrashing long enough to stabilize the immediate area while medevac drones circled. The subject roared and swung with a strength that would have demolished a smaller hero, and Homelander's counterstrike drove him into the broken street with a sound that registered as a minor quake across 3 boroughs. Control room analysts tracked muscle output, torque, and thermal spikes with the comfort of known limits, and for a moment the world returned to a shape they understood. Then the perimeter cameras caught Saitama walking through the dust cloud as if he were late for an appointment that had already been rescheduled. Homelander turned first, because there are very few things in his world that move without announcing themselves, and this one had arrived between frames. The dust parted around Saitama's shoulders without clinging, and the emergency lights reflected off his smooth head as he paused to look at the crater with a faintly apologetic expression, as though he'd found a pothole he might be responsible for. A handler began to explain the situation into his earpiece, but Saitama stepped down the slope before the sentence could finish, careful not to kick loose debris toward the drones. The test subject lunged again with the raw panic of a creature that had learned what the sky could do, and the arc of the swing crossed Saitama's path. He did not move out of the way this time, because avoiding it would have meant climbing back up the slope he just descended, and the fist connected with his shoulder in a way that snapped the attacker's wrist without transferring him even a fraction of a step. The telemetry band in the technician's hand spiked to an unreadable maximum despite not being attached, and the shock of the contact knocked the test subject sideways into a stack of collapsed scaffolding. Homelander watched the man in yellow remain exactly where he had been, brushing a small chip of concrete from his cape with mild irritation. When Saitama asked if they were done, his voice carried across the crater with the same casual tone someone might use to ask about closing time. Protocol demanded that Homelander assert control of the scene, and he moved forward with the calm authority of a brand that had never been contradicted on camera. He told Saitama to step back from the hazard, and Saitama complied by taking a single step that placed him at the edge of the crater where the dust thinned into daylight. The test subject tried to rise again, driven more by programming than intent, and Saitama sighed as if calculating the effort required to wait this out. When he extended his arm a second time, the analyst saw the motion and braced for a repeat, but the instruments that had been recalibrated minutes ago began to report mutually exclusive data before the contact was even made. The punch landed with a soft, unremarkable sound that did not match the way the subject's body folded into the street and stayed there, the crater deepening by a measurable margin that no one could explain. Homelander's heat vision ignited on instinct, a twin beam that cut across the dust toward a man who did not appear to notice it until it began to scorch the pavement behind him. Saitama turned his head, mildly inconvenienced by the brightness, and took a step to the side that left the beam carving a glowing trench through broken asphalt. The predictive suite attempted to model the interaction and returned a confident score of 0. Up on the perimeter, the medevac drones hesitated, their pathfinding systems looping as they tried to decide whether the hazard was the fallen subject or the standing civilian. Ashley authorized an escalation to live soup oversight, and the call went out for Queen Maeve and A-Train to converge, even as the legal team drafted language for an incident they could not yet describe. Saitama looked at the sky as if checking the time by the light, and asked whether someone could tell him if the nearest supermarket was still open, because he didn't want to make the trip twice. Homelander lowered himself to street level, the air around him tightening with the promise of force, and the cameras that had been capturing rescues now centered on a confrontation that no one had planned. By the time Queen Maeve's flight path intersected with A-Train's approach vector, Vought Tower had already entered an internal posture that only activated when the company's legal exposure threatened to outrun its public narrative. Ashley Barrett stood at the center of a control room that was no longer trying to predict outcomes and had instead begun documenting failures, because every model that incorporated Saitama as a variable collapsed into either statistical absurdity or blank fields that refused to populate. The brand team demanded language for a civilian anomaly, while the research division requested authority to deploy full-spectrum diagnostics, and neither department could explain why the equipment designed to measure SUPs now registered a man who appeared to weigh both nothing and an impossible amount, depending on which sensor was asked. When the first live feed of Homelander's heat vision sliding past Saitama, without producing a measurable response, reached the executive floor, a silent decision was made to move the problem out of heroics and into ownership. In the crater, Maeve landed with enough force to settle the dust into a low ring, and A-Train arrived as a distortion in the air that resolved into a human shape already scanning for angles. Homelander did not take his eyes off Saitama as he outlined the situation in a voice that suggested compliance would simplify everything, and Saitama listened with the polite patience of someone waiting for a store clerk to finish a policy explanation he didn't intend to challenge. When Maeve asked whether he was injured, Saitama looked down at the place where the test subject had struck him and shrugged, more concerned with the small tear that had formed near the hem of his glove. A train circled once, because the speedster's instincts demanded confirmation, and reported that the man's posture didn't change when displaced air hit him at a velocity that usually made bystanders stumble. Vaught's field liaison arrived with a tablet that was already failing to maintain a connection to the sublevel servers, and asked Saitama to consent to a voluntary assessment in exchange for expedited release from what they framed as protective custody. Saitama agreed because the alternative sounded like paperwork, and he stepped into the transport that had been brought up to street level, while the team continued to debate whether they were escorting a victim or containing a risk. As the doors sealed, the interior sensors registered a steady state that did not fluctuate with movement, breathing, or contact, and the attempt to establish a baseline produced a graph that resembled static. Ashley authorized a closed-route transfer to Research Wing C, a facility that had successfully quantified everything from minor telekinesis to continental lift, and the convoy began to move under a police escort that did not know what it was protecting. Inside Wing C, technicians prepared the measurement array with a precision that bordered on ritual, calibrating mass spectrometers and force plates that had been used to market gods as products. Saitama stood where they asked him to stand and raised his arms when requested, mildly inconvenienced by the number of times someone needed to adjust his cape to keep it from interfering with the readings. The first pass returned a value for his body mass that oscillated between standard human range and a figure that would have collapsed the platform beneath him, and the system attempted to reconcile the difference by running the test again at a higher resolution. The second pass produced no value at all, and the software flagged the absence as an input error despite the fact that every other channel remained stable. A thermal scan mapped his surface temperature with clinical normalcy until a deeper layer attempted to resolve energy output, at which point the image broke into a field of saturated pixels that the technicians initially mistook for interference. When they increased the gain, the saturation spread outward into the surrounding air without corresponding heat, and the safety interlocks disengaged the scanner before the lens could crack. A force application test was proposed with the assurance that it would not require Saitama to do anything more strenuous than push against a padded plate, and he complied with a nod that suggested he'd rather be elsewhere. The plate did not move, and the load cell beneath it reported a null result that forced the system to log the attempt as incomplete despite the visible compression of the padding. Upstairs, the communications team drafted a statement that described the event as a collaborative response to an emerging threat, while legal inserted language that preemptively defined Saitama as a temporary affiliate pending evaluation. Homelander watched the live feed from a private monitor, the corners of his mouth fixed in a shape that marketing had taught the world to read as reassurance, and asked whether the array could measure him with the same settings. The answer came back affirmative, and his control reading populated every expected field with comforting certainty. When the technicians returned to Saitama, the same settings generated a sequence of error codes that did not correspond to any known failure mode. An acoustic resonance test attempted to map structural integrity through harmonic response, and the emitted tones passed through him as if encountering a gap in the room's geometry, returning echoes that suggested the walls had shifted. The structural engineer overseeing the test requested a halt when the building's vibration monitors began to report phantom stresses in floors that were not connected to the lab, and the facility's maintenance AI attempted to reroute power away from circuits that were not drawing current. Saitama asked if they were almost done, because the lights were starting to buzz in a way that made his head itch, and the request was logged as a participant comfort note. Ashley received the first consolidated report and realized that the problem was not that they couldn't find Saitama's limits, but that the systems required limits to function at all. Without an upper bound, every predictive model expanded until it consumed the variables it was meant to isolate, and the risk assessment suite began to flag the act of measurement as a destabilizing influence on the environment. She authorized a transition from quantification to containment under the rationale that ownership did not require understanding, and the legal team prepared the necessary documentation to designate Saitama as a proprietary asset for public safety. In Wing C, the containment frame descended with a hum that had never before failed to quiet a room, and the locking pins began to extend toward a man who was already asking whether anyone could point him toward the exit. The containment frame did not fail all at once, which is what confused the technicians who had watched it hold sups that could level bridges without denting the locks. It engaged with the same smooth precision it always had, the pins extending toward Saitama's wrists and ankles, while the dampening field stabilized the air in a way that usually made conversations sound distant. He did not resist as the cuffs settled into place, because standing still was easier than arguing, and for a few seconds the room returned to the familiar rhythm of a successful capture. Then the field harmonics began to drift without any corresponding change in output, and the display that monitored internal stress registered a load that could not be attributed to any component in the frame. Saitama shifted his weight because one of the cuffs was pressing into his glove seam, and the entire assembly adjusted, as if it had been mounted on a surface that had decided to move. The locking pins remained extended but no longer appeared to be touching anything, and the field generator compensated by increasing amplitude until the warning indicators tripped in sequence. A technician reached for the emergency release out of habit, only to find that the interface no longer recognized the hardware as present. When Saitama asked if he could take the glove off for a second, the system interpreted the motion as a containment breach and initiated a lockdown that sealed Wing C behind blast doors. Across the facility, the pressure sensors began to report discrepancies that spread from the lab into adjacent floors, and the building's stabilization software attempted to reconcile a mass that registered in the room without corresponding to any of the objects it could identify. Ashley authorized a controlled evacuation of non-essential staff, while the research lead insisted that the readings did not indicate an active threat, which would have been reassuring if the vibration monitors hadn't started to pick up movement in structural members that were not designed to flex. Saitama removed the glove with a small tug that should not have mattered, and the field generator shut itself down as if the act had exceeded its operating assumptions. The cuffs remained closed in the air for a moment before dropping to the platform, with a sound that carried through the sealed doors. Outside, the city had begun to react to the earlier impact with the familiar choreography of sirens and rerouted traffic, but the municipal grid was now reporting power fluctuations that traced back to Vought Tower rather than the crater. Emergency crews attempting to coordinate found their comms drifting into static whenever Wing C's systems spooled up for another attempt, and a subway line halted between stations when the track monitors misread a load that wasn't there. The mayor's office requested clarification, while the brand team pushed a reassurance package that described ongoing hero activity in the area, and neither message survived contact with a public that could see lights flickering across entire blocks. When the first transformer blew on the west side, the utility company attributed it to cascading demand before noticing that the spike had not originated in their network. In the lab, a secondary containment shell descended with a heavier hum, designed to isolate kinetic anomalies through layered counterfields that had never needed to be stacked before. Saitama watched it settle with mild curiosity and stepped forward because someone had asked him to remain within the marked area, and the shell's proximity sensors reported both immediate contact and none at all. The counterfields attempted to establish a gradient and instead flattened into a uniform output that extended beyond the shell's boundary, nudging unsecured equipment toward the walls. A rack of diagnostic tools slid across the floor and came to rest against a door that had been sealed from the outside. Homelander arrived on the observation deck with Maeve and A-Train close behind, their presence less about force and more about assurance that the situation remained under hero supervision. He asked for a live demonstration of compliance, and the research lead requested that Saitama place his hand on a calibrated plate to establish a control interaction. Saitama obliged because the request sounded simple, and the plate's readout cycled through values too quickly to log before settling on a line that read indeterminate in 3 languages. A-Train commented that the air felt heavy, and Maeve noticed that the dust on the far wall had begun to tremble without any visible draft. The containment shell's inner layer attempted a localized compression to test resistance, and the effect propagated outward through the floor as a ripple that set off glass break sensors in offices 3 levels up. Vought City liaison reported that traffic lights along 5th had begun to desynchronize, and a hospital's backup generator kicked in when its mains dropped for a fraction of a second that should not have mattered. Ashley ordered a full facility isolation, but the maintenance AI returned a refusal when it could not verify the existence of a boundary to isolate. Saitama asked if there was a way to turn the buzzing off because it was starting to bother him, and the request coincided with a spike that knocked the shell's outer layer offline. Emergency services now had to contend with elevator banks that stalled between floors and data centers that rebooted in unison, and the city's incident command began to treat Vought Tower as the source of an infrastructure event rather than its solution. The shell's final layer engaged with a tone that dipped into frequencies the human ear does not prefer, and Saitama raised a hand to his head as if warding off a headache. The gesture caused the room's pressure differential to equalize in a way that popped a seal on a distant fire door, and the resulting airflow carried loose papers down a hallway that had been cleared minutes before. On the observation deck, Homelander's eyes narrowed as the monitors displayed a map of disruptions radiating outward from a lab that was supposed to contain them. The request for federal coordination did not originate with Vaught's executive office, which would later become a point of contention in hearings that had not yet been scheduled, but from the city's incident command when infrastructure failures began to present with a radius that no longer tracked with any known disaster model. Elevators stalled in hospitals that had redundant power, traffic control systems defaulted to flashing modes across borough lines, and a data center in Queens reported simultaneous checksum errors on hardware that had been air-gapped since installation. The common denominator in each disruption was proximity to Vought Tower, and when the maintenance AI inside Wing C refused another isolation command on the grounds that it could not establish a stable perimeter, the liaison escalated the situation to national response. Within minutes, a joint task force had been authorized to stage equipment that had only ever been deployed for SUPs who had chosen to become enemies of the state. Inside the lab, Saitama shifted from one foot to the other because the floor had begun to vibrate at a frequency that made standing still mildly unpleasant, and he asked if there was somewhere he could sit while they finished. The research lead authorized a bench that was bolted to the platform, and the bolts registered a torque that did not correspond to any applied force when he lowered himself onto it. A layered counterfield spun up again with modified parameters designed to dampen the interaction between his presence and the building structure, and the result was a redistribution of load that maintenance software interpreted as phantom occupancy on floors that were empty. When the air conditioning unit above the lab cycled without command, a technician noted that the intake filters had begun to bow inward despite no change in airflow. On the observation deck, Homelander watched the feeds from a military convoy moving into position 3 blocks out, the vehicles carrying a portable suppression array calibrated to disrupt high-tier bioelectric output. Queen Maeve asked whether deploying federal hardware inside a corporate facility might complicate ownership, and Ashley responded that ownership had already been complicated by the fact that their instruments could not describe what they were looking at. A train reported that the lobby cameras were jittering in a way that suggested frame loss, and the IT director confirmed that the jitter corresponded with every attempt to increase containment amplitude in Wing C. The decision to grant the task force temporary access was framed as a partnership for public safety, even as legal began to prepare for the argument that would follow. The suppression array was assembled with practice speed in a staging area adjacent to the lab, its emitters angled toward the containment shell that had failed to maintain a consistent boundary. Saitama glanced at it with the same passing interest he might give to a vending machine, and asked if the buzzing would stop when they turned it on. The lead officer assured him that the system would stabilize environmental interference, and initiated a low-power test that caused the overhead lights to dim across the entire wing. The array's readouts populated with expected baselines for every soup in the room, including Homelander, whose control line remained comfortably within tolerances. When the array's field intersected Saitama, the baselines inverted without transitioning through any intermediate state, and the display began to alternate between saturation and null as if it could not decide whether it was measuring something infinite or nothing at all. The containment shell attempted to synchronize with the new field, and instead shed its outer layer with a sound like a dropped sheet of metal, and the platform's load sensors reported a negative value that maintenance software flagged as a fault. Saitama raised a hand to his ear because the tone had shifted into something that made his teeth feel strange, and the act coincided with a cascade that knocked out a row of servers on the floor above. Outside, the convoy's command vehicle lost telemetry from the array even as the local monitors insisted it remained active, and the officer ordered an increase in output that pushed the emitters into a regime they were not rated to sustain. The building's fire suppression system activated on a floor that was not on fire, and the resulting water flow tripped breakers that had been insulated from one another by design. A hospital on the east side reported a momentary failure in imaging equipment, and the city's grid operator requested immediate clarification as brownouts began to propagate along lines that did not share a transformer. Homelander stepped into the lab with a calm that had been engineered for cameras and told the officer to hold at current output while they reassessed. Saitama looked up at him and asked if this would take much longer, because he had a coupon that expired tonight, and the research lead attempted to log the comment before the tablet in his hand rebooted without warning. The suppression array's emitters began to hum at a pitch that climbed past audible range, and the floor beneath them flexed by a measurable fraction of a millimeter that no one could attribute to structural load. On the building's exterior, a line of windows cracked in unison. The Joint Task Force did not wait for a second authorization when the suppression array began returning contradictory telemetry to both Vought's internal monitors and the military's independent feed, because the discrepancy itself had already triggered a contingency designed for anomalies that could not be reconciled through calibration. Within minutes, a satellite relay was tasked to observe Vought Tower at a resolution normally reserved for missile launches, and the first pass returned a thermal profile that was both entirely ordinary and impossible to map beyond the exterior walls. The discrepancy forced a retasking of orbital assets that had been tracking weather systems over the Atlantic, and the global grid operator requested a coordination call when the timing signals from a civilian GPS cluster began to drift in a pattern that traced back to Manhattan. In cities that had no reason to be watching, infrastructure dashboards flickered as if a load had been applied somewhere they could not see. Inside Wing C, the suppression array's hum climbed into a vibration that passed through bone rather than air, and Saitama shifted on the bench because the sensation was starting to feel like someone tapping the inside of his head. The emitters adjusted their phase in response to readings that did not stabilize, and the containment shell attempted to mirror the new pattern with a delay that introduced a feedback loop into the lab's power distribution. The building's backup generators spun up even as the mains reported nominal supply, and the maintenance AI attempted to prioritize circuits that were no longer drawing current. When Saitama asked if they could turn it down a little, the request coincided with a spike that propagated through the wing and tripped breakers on a floor that had already been evacuated. On the observation deck, Ashley watched a map populate with reports from as far away as Boston and Toronto, where traffic control systems had entered safe mode for reasons the municipalities could not attribute to weather or demand. A research liaison from Vought's European branch called in to report transient faults in a lab that had been testing compound V derivatives, and the time stamp on the fault aligned with the moment the array's phase had shifted in Manhattan. Queen Maeve asked whether they were looking at a coincidence, and the liaison responded that coincidences did not usually present with synchronized checksum errors across continents. A train, who had been packing out of habit, slowed when he realized the air in the room felt denser than it had minutes before. Homelander ordered the array held at current output, despite the officer's warning that the emitters were approaching a thermal limit, because turning it off would mean losing the only tool that appeared to interact with the anomaly at all. Saitama rubbed his temple with 2 fingers and looked toward the door, as if calculating the effort required to walk out, and the platform beneath him registered a load change that did not correspond to movement. The containment shell shed another layer without transitioning through a failure state, and the lab's acoustic monitors picked up a tone that had no source in the room. When the fire suppression system activated again on a floor above, the water flowed sideways for a moment before settling into gravity. At the Federal Command Post, analysts overlaid the Manhattan disruptions with reports from overseas and found a correlation that did not decay with distance, forcing them to consider the possibility that the event was not local to the building at all. A decision was made to route power away from the borough in a controlled brownout to reduce environmental variables, and the attempt resulted in a phase mismatch that tripped substations 2 states away. Hospitals shifted to generator power, while air traffic controllers requested clarification on a navigation drift that had not appeared on their instruments minutes before. The satellite relay returned another pass that showed no change in the tower's exterior profile despite the reports from inside. Back in Wing C, the officer initiated a cooling cycle on the suppression array that required a temporary dip in output, and the emitters complied with a drop that made the room feel suddenly larger. Saitama lowered his hand from his head and asked if they were done yet, because the lights had stopped buzzing for a second. The momentary relief coincided with a cascade of faults in data centers across the eastern seaboard, and the grid operator reported a frequency wobble that did not correspond to any known load. Homelander looked at the live feed as the containment shell's final layer attempted to re-engage and instead settled into the floor like a reflection. Outside, the sky over the city held steady, while systems on the ground tried to decide whether they were failing or being asked to do something they had never been designed to attempt. Ashley authorized a global advisory to Vought affiliates with instructions to log any anomalies regardless of scale, and the responses began to arrive before the message had finished sending. In the lab, the suppression array's thermal warning reached a threshold that would normally trigger an automatic shutdown, and the officer's hand hovered over the manual override as the emitters continued to climb. The manual override was not designed to be dramatic, which is why the officer hesitated for half a second when the array's thermal limit crossed into a region that the safety software had already flagged as unsustainable. The emitters were meant to protect themselves by stepping down before damage could occur, but the command link now returned a latency that did not match the cable length, and the officer had to choose between trusting automation that no longer described reality or forcing a change that might remove the only influence they appeared to have. Homelander told him to hold the line in a voice that carried the weight of public expectation, and the officer complied, because the alternative would have been admitting that the system had never interacted with the problem at all. The array continued to hum at a pitch that had migrated beyond hearing, and the lab's vibration monitors registered a stability that existed nowhere else in the building. Saitama lowered his hand from his temple when the tone settled into something that felt less intrusive, and he looked at the containment shell with mild curiosity as its remaining layer flickered between present and not. The bench beneath him creaked without moving, and the platform's load sensors reported a value that the maintenance AI attempted to distribute across adjacent floors. Queen Maeve asked whether they were stabilizing the environment or simply forcing it to fail elsewhere, and the research lead admitted that the difference had become difficult to quantify. A train, who had been watching dust drift along the far wall, noted that it now moved in a pattern that suggested a draft from a door that had not opened. Resistance, as Vought understood it, meant asserting a framework over chaos, and the next measure arrived in the form of a kinetic dampening rig designed to absorb impact from sups who had chosen to test the limits of custody. The rig was deployed around Saitama with articulated arms that extended padded plates toward his shoulders and torso, and the control software began to map contact points before the plates had finished moving. Saitama leaned back slightly to keep the padding from pressing into his neck, and the arms adjusted as if they had encountered a surface that was not where the cameras indicated it should be. The dampening gel within the plates attempted to conform, and instead sheared along a boundary that no one could see. Outside Wing C, the building's stabilization software began to route phantom loads into structural members that had already been cleared, and the result was a flex that maintenance had never recorded in those beams. The officer requested permission to increase array output by a fractional margin, and Ashley authorized the change, with the understanding that the emitters would not survive another thermal climb. When the output ticked upward, the dampening rig sensors reported a contact force that exceeded its calibration, and then dropped to zero without transitioning through any intermediate state. Saitama asked whether he could stand up for a second because his legs were starting to go numb. Homelander stepped closer as the articulated arms retracted and redeployed in an attempt to maintain compliance, and told Saitama to remain seated while they finished the procedure. Saitama considered the request and stayed where he was because it sounded easier than arguing, and the platform beneath him registered a change that the system attributed to environmental drift. The array's emitters glowed with a heat that would have triggered shutdown in any other context, and the officer reported that the cooling cycle had lost efficacy despite a steady coolant flow. On the observation deck, Maeve watched the monitors display a lab that was now the only room in the building not reporting vibration. Across the city, the brownout that had been intended to simplify variables instead revealed a network that had begun to behave as if it were compensating for a missing reference. Traffic control systems defaulted to patterns that had not been used in decades, and a bridge authority reported a load distribution that did not match the vehicles on its span. The federal command post overlaid the new data with the earlier overseas reports and found that the correlation had strengthened rather than decayed, forcing a revision of a model that had assumed locality. A decision was made to bring a second suppression array into position, despite the knowledge that synchronizing two fields could introduce interference that would be difficult to predict. Back in the lab, the dampening rig attempted one final adjustment that brought its plates within a centimeter of Saitama's shoulders, and the gel within them settled as if encountering a solid surface. The contact held for a fraction of a second before the rig's sensors reported a compression that did not correspond to displacement, and the articulated arms locked to prevent collapse. Saitama shifted to ease the pressure on his cape, and the locks engaged with a snap that echoed through the room. The array's emitters climbed another degree toward failure, as the officer watched the override timer count down to a shutdown that would remove the only variable anyone believed they could influence. The second suppression array arrived with a convoy that no longer bothered with sirens, because the streets around Vought Tower had already emptied into a perimeter that extended beyond anything the city had planned for. The emitters were mounted in a mirrored configuration designed to create a standing interference pattern, and the federal officer overseeing deployment acknowledged that synchronizing two fields in close proximity could destabilize both if their phase alignment drifted by even a fraction. Ashley authorized the risk because the alternative was watching the first array fail in isolation, and the research lead insisted that resistance required redundancy when understanding had been exhausted. Inside Wing C, the articulated arms of the dampening rig remained locked, their plates hovering at a distance the sensors insisted was contact. Saitama watched the new equipment roll into place with the mild interest he might give to a different brand of heater, and asked whether this one would make the buzzing stop completely. The officer explained that the second array would stabilize the interference created by the first, and initiated a calibration that caused the overhead lights to dim across 3 floors. Homelander's control reading populated on both displays with the same reassuring consistency as before, and Queen Maeve's baseline remained within expected variance. When the system attempted to map Saitama, the 2 arrays disagreed on whether he occupied the space between them. The synchronization routine began with a low-amplitude sweep that usually settled into a stable phase within seconds, but this time, the interference pattern expanded beyond the lab's boundary, as if the room were larger than its walls. The building's maintenance AI attempted to compensate by adjusting load distribution in adjacent support columns, and the resulting flex tripped a structural alert that had not been seen since the tower's construction. Atrain felt the change first as a pressure in his chest that made breathing slightly more deliberate, and he stepped back from the observation glass as dust along the frame began to tremble. The officer increased the amplitude to force alignment, and the arrays responded with a tone that made the air feel textured. The dampening rig sensors reported simultaneous compression and release, and the articulated arms attempted to reconcile the contradiction by cycling their locks in sequence. Saitama shifted his shoulders to keep the plates from catching on his cape, and the motion coincided with a cascade that knocked the lab's internal network offline for a full second. When the feed returned, the phase alignment had settled into a pattern that the software labeled stable, despite a drift that could not be corrected through calibration. Ashley requested confirmation that the stability would hold, and the officer admitted that the label now referred to consistency rather than control. Outside the facility, the city's grid operator reported that the earlier brownout had begun to oscillate, with substations tripping and resetting in a rhythm that did not match demand. Hospitals shifted to generator power again when their mains reported a frequency that hovered just outside tolerance, and an airport authority requested immediate guidance as navigation drift reappeared on runways that had been cleared. The Federal Command Post overlaid the new disruptions with the Manhattan feed and found that the correlation had intensified, forcing them to consider that the synchronized arrays had created a wider coupling rather than an isolated dampening. In Wing C, the array's interference pattern pressed against the containment shell's last remaining layer, and the field flattened into a uniform output that extended beyond the room. Saitama raised a hand to his ear as the tone climbed into something that made his jaw feel tight, and asked if they could turn it down a little because it was starting to bother him again. The request coincided with a thermal spike that pushed both arrays into a regime their cooling systems were not designed to sustain, and the officer's override timer reset without command. Homelander watched the displays populate with error codes that did not correspond to any known failure mode. The articulated arms of the dampening rig disengaged to prevent structural collapse, and the plates retracted with a hiss that echoed through the sealed doors. The platform beneath Saitama registered a load change that maintenance software attempted to distribute across floors that were not connected, and a line of windows on the tower's exterior cracked in unison. Maeve asked whether they were forcing the problem outward, and the research lead responded that the alternative was allowing it to concentrate. On the observation deck, the second array's phase drifted by a fraction that should have been corrected automatically, and the interference pattern shifted into a configuration that the software could not model. The lab's acoustic monitors picked up a tone that had no source in the room, and the maintenance AI requested permission to isolate Wing C for the 3rd time. Ashley denied the request when the system admitted it could not verify a boundary to isolate, and the officer reported that both arrays had entered a thermal state that would trigger automatic shutdown within seconds. The automatic shutdown did not occur when the thermal threshold was crossed, which was the first indication that the suppression arrays were no longer operating within the logic that governed their design. Both units continued to emit despite coolant flow that should have forced a step-down, and the interference pattern between them expanded into a uniform field that extended beyond Wing C without decaying at the edges. The maintenance AI attempted to reclassify the condition as an environmental hazard and found that the hazard could not be located within any room it recognized. Outside the tower, substations that had been cycling for minutes now tripped into a sustained outage that left entire districts in darkness, and the city's emergency grid began to fail in sectors that had never shared infrastructure. Inside the lab, Saitama stood because the bench had begun to vibrate again in a way that made sitting mildly inconvenient, and the platform beneath him registered a load change that did not correspond to movement. He asked if the buzzing would stop if he stepped outside, and the officer told him to remain where he was while they completed the stabilization cycle. The moment he shifted his weight, the interference pattern altered without transitioning through any measurable phase, and the displays populated with values that the software refused to log. Homelander watched the change with a focus that had never been necessary before, because the room had begun to feel like it was resisting its own dimensions. Across the city, hospital generators reported a harmonic in their output that did not match any mechanical fault, and an air traffic controller in Newark watched a runway's lighting system pulse in a rhythm that had not been programmed. The Federal Command Post overlaid the anomalies with a global feed and found that data centers overseas were now reporting synchronized checksum errors with no network link between them. A decision was made to sever the tower from the national grid entirely, and the attempt resulted in a phase mismatch that tripped a substation in Ohio. The satellite relay returned an image of Manhattan that looked unchanged from orbit despite the failures cascading below. Back in Wing C, the containment shell's final layer attempted to re-engage and instead settled into the floor like a reflection, its boundary no longer aligning with the room's geometry. Saitama raised a hand to his head as the tone climbed into something that made his teeth ache, and asked again if they could turn it down because it was starting to bother him. The request coincided with a cascade that took the observation deck offline for a full second, and when the feed returned, the array's interference pattern had flattened into a steady state that the software labeled indeterminate. Queen Maeve felt the pressure change as a weight behind her eyes, and A-Train steadied himself against the glass that now hummed with a sound no one could hear. Ashley authorized a facility-wide evacuation that could not be completed when the elevator bank stalled between floors, and the stairwells filled with personnel who found the air growing thicker with each level they descended. The research lead attempted to log the change and watched the tablet in his hand reboot without warning, the data vanishing into a system that could not confirm its own uptime. Outside, a bridge authority reported a load distribution that did not match the vehicles on its span, and a water treatment plant on the east side shut itself down when its sensors returned a pressure that did not exist in any pipe. In the lab, the array's emitters glowed with a heat that should have forced a shutdown minutes ago, and the officer's override timer reset again without input. Homelander stepped forward with the calm that had always translated into control, and told Saitama to remain still while they resolved the interference. Saitama looked at the door as if calculating the effort required to leave, and the platform beneath him registered a negative load that maintenance software flagged as a fault. The moment he took a step toward the exit, the interference pattern shifted in a way that caused a line of windows across the tower's exterior to shatter simultaneously. Across the river, an entire block lost power as substations tripped into a sustained outage, and the city's incident command began to route emergency services away from Manhattan altogether. The Federal Command Post overlaid the new data with overseas reports and found that the correlation had strengthened to the point where distance no longer mattered, forcing a revision of a model that had assumed locality. A hospital in Montreal reported a momentary failure in imaging equipment, and a lab in Berlin logged a transient fault in a test chamber that had been sealed for months. In Wing C, the array's interference pattern pressed against the room's boundaries until the acoustic monitors picked up a tone that had no source in the building. Saitama paused because the buzzing had reached a pitch that made thinking mildly inconvenient, and raised his hand as if to rub his temple. The gesture coincided with a cascade that knocked out the tower's internal network entirely, and the maintenance AI returned a final request to isolate a space it could no longer define. The tower's internal network did not recover when the cascade ended, which left the suppression arrays operating on local control loops that had already failed to interpret their own telemetry. Both units continued to emit at a thermal state that should have triggered a hard shutdown, and the cooling systems cycled without reducing output as if heat were no longer the relevant variable. In the darkened observation deck, emergency lighting revealed displays frozen on values that read as both maximum and null, and the absence of updates made it impossible to determine whether the interference pattern had stabilized or simply ceased to report. Outside, emergency services began to withdraw from Manhattan when navigation drift made routing unreliable, and the city's incident command rerouted resources to boroughs that had not yet entered a sustained outage. Inside Wing C, the air felt dense enough that breathing required a deliberate rhythm, and Saitama stood near the platform's edge because the buzzing had settled into something less intrusive when he faced the door. He asked whether stepping outside would help, and the officer repeated the instruction to remain where he was while they completed the cycle. The moment he shifted his stance, the interference pattern altered without transitioning through any measurable phase, and the articulated arms of the dampening rig attempted to deploy before locking halfway. Homelander watched the movement with a focus that had replaced the earlier assurance, because the room now appeared to resist any change in posture. Across the river, a data center that had been offline for maintenance reported a boot sequence it had not initiated, and the checksum errors that had appeared overseas now aligned with the moment Saitama's foot crossed the platform's boundary marking. The federal command post overlaid the new anomalies with a global feed and found that the correlation had intensified again, forcing them to consider that the synchronized arrays had created a coupling that no longer required proximity. A hospital in Boston reported a harmonic in its generator output that did not match any mechanical fault, and a lab in Tokyo logged a transient pressure change in a sealed chamber. The satellite relay returned another pass that showed the tower's exterior unchanged despite the failures propagating worldwide. Back in the lab, the containment shell's last remaining layer attempted to re-engage and instead settled into a position that did not align with the floor, its boundary slipping against the room's geometry. Saitama raised a hand to his ear as the tone climbed into something that made his jaw feel tight, and asked if they could turn it down because it was starting to bother him again. The request coincided with a cascade that tripped substations across 2 states, and the city's grid operator reported a frequency wobble that did not correspond to any known load. Queen Maeve steadied herself against the observation glass as a line of windows on the tower's exterior cracked in sequence. Ashley authorized a full evacuation of the facility that could not be completed when the stairwell lighting failed, and personnel found themselves descending by emergency glow that flickered in a rhythm they could not attribute to power. The research lead attempted to log the change and watched the tablet in his hand reboot without warning, the data vanishing into a system that could not confirm its own uptime. Outside, a bridge authority reported a load distribution that did not match the vehicles on its span, and an airport authority requested immediate guidance as runway lighting began to pulse. In Wing C, the array's emitters glowed with a heat that should have forced a shutdown minutes ago, and the officer's override timer reset for the 3rd time without input. Homelander stepped forward with a calm that had always translated into control, and told Saitama to remain still while they resolved the interference. Saitama looked at the door as if calculating the effort required to leave, and the platform beneath him registered a negative load that maintenance software flagged as a fault. The moment he took another step toward the exit, the interference pattern shifted in a way that caused emergency lighting across 3 floors to extinguish simultaneously. Across the Atlantic, a lab in Berlin reported a transient fault in a test chamber that had been sealed for months, and a water treatment plant in Toronto shut itself down when its sensors returned a pressure that did not exist in any pipe. The Federal Command Post revised its model again, removing locality as a factor and replacing it with a coupling that had no defined boundary. The satellite relay returned an image of Manhattan that looked unchanged from orbit, despite the failures cascading below. In the lab, the acoustic monitors picked up a tone that had no source in the building, and the maintenance AI returned a final request to isolate a space it could no longer define. Saitama paused because the buzzing had reached a pitch that made thinking mildly inconvenient, and raised his hand as if to rub his temple. The gesture coincided with a cascade that knocked out the tower's emergency lighting entirely, leaving the array's glow as the only illumination. The darkness that followed the loss of emergency lighting did not behave like an absence of power so much as a refusal of illumination, because the suppression arrays, glow failed to cast shadows where it should have, and the observation glass reflected a room that no longer aligned with the one behind it. Homelander remained at the edge of the platform with a stillness that had always been read as confidence, and Queen Maeve steadied herself against a railing that vibrated without moving. A train found that his breath came shorter than it should in a room that had not changed its volume, and the officer overseeing the arrays watched the override timer reset again without input. Outside, Manhattan's grid slipped into a sustained outage that emergency planners had never modeled, and the city's incident command began to route response through neighboring states. Inside Wing C, Saitama lowered his hand from his temple because the tone had settled into something that felt less intrusive when he faced the door, and he asked whether stepping outside would help stop the buzzing. The officer repeated the instruction to remain where he was while they completed the cycle, but the request no longer aligned with a system that had lost its boundaries. The moment Saitama shifted his stance, the interference pattern altered without transitioning through any measurable phase, and the articulated arms of the dampening rig attempted to deploy before locking halfway. The platform beneath him registered a load change that maintenance software flagged as negative despite no corresponding movement. Across the country, substations that had been cycling for minutes tripped into sustained failure, and a hospital in Chicago reported a harmonic in its generator output that did not match any mechanical fault. The Federal Command Post overlaid the new anomalies with a global feed and found that data centers overseas were now reporting synchronized checksum errors with no network link between them. A lab in Tokyo logged a transient pressure change in a sealed chamber, and a bridge authority in Montreal reported a load distribution that did not match the vehicles on its span. The satellite relay returned another pass that showed the tower's exterior unchanged despite the failures propagating worldwide. Back in the lab, the containment shell's last remaining layer attempted to re-engage and instead settled into a position that did not align with the floor, its boundary slipping against the room's geometry. Saitama raised a hand to his ear as the tone climbed into something that made his jaw feel tight, and asked again if they could turn it down because it was starting to bother him. The request coincided with a cascade that tripped substations across 2 states, and the city's grid operator reported a frequency wobble that did not correspond to any known load. Queen Maeve watched a line of windows on the tower's exterior shatter in sequence that matched the rhythm of the array's hum. Ashley authorized a final attempt to decouple the arrays from the building's power distribution, and the officer initiated a manual disconnect, that required him to override safeguards designed to prevent catastrophic arcing. The cables did not spark when they were separated, and the emitters continued to glow at a thermal state that should not have been possible without input. Homelander stepped closer to Saitama with a calm that had always translated into control, and told him to remain still while they resolved the interference. Saitama looked at the door as if calculating the effort required to leave, and the platform beneath him registered a change that did not correspond to any applied force. Outside, air traffic controllers began to ground flights when navigation drift reappeared on runways that had been cleared, and a water treatment plant on the east side shut itself down when its sensors returned a pressure that did not exist in any pipe. The Federal Command Post revised its model again, removing locality as a factor and replacing it with a coupling that had no defined boundary. A lab in Berlin reported a transient fault in a test chamber that had been sealed for months, and the checksum errors overseas aligned with the moment Saitama's foot crossed the platform's boundary marking. In Wing C, the acoustic monitors picked up a tone that had no source in the building, and the maintenance AI returned a final request to isolate a space it could no longer define. Saitama paused because the buzzing had reached a pitch that made thinking mildly inconvenient, and he asked if he could just step outside for a minute. The moment he moved toward the exit, the interference pattern shifted in a way that caused the arrays glow to dim without reducing output, and the room's geometry appeared to settle into a configuration that the software could not model. Across the river, an entire district lost power as substations tripped into sustained outage, and the city's incident command began to route emergency services away from Manhattan altogether. The satellite relay returned an image of the tower that looked unchanged from orbit despite the failures cascading below, and the global feed populated with reports that no longer decayed with distance. In the lab, the officer watched the override timer reset one final time as the emitters continued to climb toward a state they were not designed to sustain. The final failure did not arrive as an explosion or a collapse, but as a quiet change in the way the room allowed itself to exist, because the suppression arrays continued to emit without drawing power, and the glow that had illuminated Wing C no longer interacted with the walls. The officer's override timer remained frozen on a value that could not be reached through any countdown, and the articulated arms of the dampening rig hung in a posture that implied contact without touching anything at all. Homelander stood close enough to feel the air resist his breath, and Queen Maeve watched the observation glass reflect a version of the lab that did not match the one she could see. Outside, Manhattan's sustained outage spread into boroughs that had been insulated by design, and the city's incident command began to treat the island as an exclusion zone rather than a service area. Inside Wing C, Saitama shifted his weight because the buzzing had finally reached a pitch that made standing still mildly irritating, and he asked whether stepping outside would help stop it. The officer repeated the instruction to remain where he was while they completed the cycle, but the request no longer corresponded to a system that could describe what completion meant. The moment Saitama took another step toward the door, the interference pattern altered without transitioning through any measurable phase, and the containment shell's last remaining layer slid across the floor like a shadow. The platform beneath him registered a load change that maintenance software could not distribute to any adjacent structure. Across the country, substations that had been cycling for minutes tripped into sustained failure, and a hospital in Chicago reported a harmonic in its generator output that did not match any mechanical fault. The Federal Command Post overlaid the new anomalies with a global feed, and found that data centers overseas were now reporting synchronized checksum errors with no network link between them. A lab in Tokyo logged a transient pressure change in a sealed chamber, and a bridge authority in Montreal reported a load distribution that did not match the vehicles on its span. The satellite relay returned another pass that showed the tower's exterior unchanged despite the failures propagating worldwide. Back in the lab, the acoustic monitors picked up a tone that had no source in the building, and the maintenance AI returned a final request to isolate a space it could no longer define. Saitama raised a hand to his ear and asked if someone could just turn it down for a second, because it was starting to give him a headache. The request coincided with a cascade that knocked out the tower's internal sensors entirely, leaving the arrays glow as the only illumination that did not cast shadows. Homelander told him to remain still with a calm that had always translated into control, and the platform beneath Saitama registered a negative load despite no corresponding movement. Outside, air traffic controllers began to ground flights when navigation drift reappeared on runways that had been cleared, and a water treatment plant on the east side shut itself down when its sensors returned a pressure that did not exist in any pipe. The Federal Command Post revised its model again, removing locality as a factor and replacing it with a coupling that had no defined boundary. A lab in Berlin reported a transient fault in a test chamber that had been sealed for months, and the checksum errors overseas aligned with the moment Saitama's foot crossed the platform's boundary marking. Saitama reached the door because it was easier than waiting, and the array's interference pattern shifted in a way that caused the glow to dim without reducing output. The room's geometry appeared to settle into a configuration that the software could not model, and the containment shell's final layer dissolved into a position that no longer aligned with the floor. The moment his hand touched the handle, the tone that had filled the building stopped without fatting, and the articulated arms of the dampening rig disengaged in sequence. Across Manhattan, emergency lighting returned to buildings that had been dark for hours, but the grid operator reported that the restoration did not correspond to any input from their network. Substations remained tripped in states that had never shared infrastructure, and the global feed populated with reports from overseas that did not decay with distance. The satellite relay returned an image of the tower that looked unchanged from orbit despite the failures cascading below, and the Federal Command Post logged a final model that removed containment as a viable strategy. Saitama opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the buzzing gone in a way that made the air feel normal again, and asked if someone could point him toward the exit because the supermarket would be closing soon. Behind him, the suppression arrays continued to emit without drawing power, their glow settling into a steady state that did not interact with the room. Vought's instruments returned values that could not be logged, and the city's exclusion zone remained in place even as the lights came back on in districts that had never lost them. The world did not return to normal because the systems that had defined power could no longer agree on what power meant, and the one variable they had attempted to measure had simply left the room.